Welcome to the deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Today, we're diving headfirst into cybersecurity and tech innovations.
Sounds good.
And I think some of this stuff is really going to make you go, wait, what?
I hope so.
Because we're going to look at some stories that show how even the most secure systems have cracks, nation-state espionage, and especially some concerns about Chinese-built infrastructure. And then, of course, some new tech tools and trends, both good and bad.
Well, it is a digital jungle out there, so it's very easy to get lost in the complexity and miss the bigger picture.
That's why we're here. We're going to help you cut through the noise and uncover the real story behind all these headlines.
Yeah, and arm you with the knowledge you need to actually make good decisions about your own security and privacy.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump right in. Our first stop takes us deep into the world of cyber espionage, and this story sounds like it's straight out of a spy thriller. It involves the infamous Russian hacking group APT28.
Ooh, yeah.
And this ingenious attack they pulled off, dubbed the nearest neighbor attack.
What's fascinating about this case is how it highlights the completely unexpected ways that attackers can exploit seemingly harmless entry points.
So set the scene for us. What exactly did APT28 do?
Okay, so imagine this. APT28, they wanted to hack into this specific U.S. company.
Yeah.
But they were thousands of miles away.
Oh.
So instead of directly attacking them, they first compromised a completely different organization in a nearby building.
Okay.
And they did this simply by exploiting weak Wi-Fi security.
So they basically hacked their neighbor's Wi-Fi.
Yes.
To get close to the target?
Exactly.
That's clever, but also scary.
Yeah. It's this tactic known as pivoting.
Okay.
And they use that initial compromise as kind of a stepping stone to hop over to the network they actually wanted.
So like digital island hopping.
Exactly.
From one compromised system to the next.
Exactly.
Oh, man. That reminds me, I need to check my Wi-Fi password.
Absolutely, yeah. But what's even more important than that is the lesson about logging. So imagine if the target company had had really extensive logs of all their network activity.
Yeah.
They could have potentially spotted this unusual Wi-Fi connection and stopped APT28 right there.
So you're saying logs are like security cameras for your network?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
They act as this like digital breadcrumb trail that allows you to retrace the steps of an attacker and really figure out how they got in.
You know, I always thought of logs as these massive technical files, but I like how you frame it thinking about it like a time machine. That makes a lot more sense.
Exactly.
It's a way to go back and figure out what happened.
Exactly. And especially with storage being so affordable these days, there's really no excuse to not be logging everything.
All right, let's shift gears from the shadows of cyber espionage to something a little brighter, a little more positive. Let's Encrypt, which just celebrated its 10th anniversary.
Happy birthday.
You may not know the name, but they've had a huge impact on making the internet safer for all of us.
So Let's Encrypt is a nonprofit certificate authority that provides free SSL/TLS certificates. Those are kind of the backbone of HTTPS connections. So remember back in the day, you used to get all those not secure warnings in your browser?
I remember those days. You never quite knew if it was safe to put in your credit card information.
Right, right. So encryption used to be this complex and expensive process, mainly reserved for websites handling sensitive financial data. But Let's Encrypt totally changed the game by making encryption accessible to everyone.
So how has their success affected things like, say, phishing attacks?
Made a huge difference. So think about it. Phishing attacks rely on tricking people into visiting these fake websites that look identical to the real deal, right?
Right.
But with HTTPS and those little padlock icons in the browser, it's so much easier to spot those fakes.
So Let's Encrypt has essentially raised the bar for everyone, made it harder for the bad guys.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But what about those who haven't gotten the memo? I mean, do we still have to worry about those unencrypted sites?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are still some stragglers.
Okay.
But the good news is, thanks to Let's Encrypt, the vast majority of websites now are HTTPS.
That's good news.
Yeah.
Speaking of security, this next topic is a bit of a head-scratcher.
Yeah.
It turns out that 80% of the giant cranes used at U.S. ports, you know, the ones that load and unload cargo ships, are made by a single Chinese company, ZPMC.
Interesting.
And the Coast Guard is now raising concerns about potential security risks.
It's a very complex issue.
Okay.
It really highlights this tension between economic interdependence and national security.
Okay.
So on one hand, you have these cranes. They're incredibly efficient.
Mm-hmm.
They're very advanced. They play a vital role in global trade.
Right, but on the other hand,
Yeah.
we have the Coast Guard worried about potential vulnerabilities, like backdoors that could allow someone to remotely access and control them.
Yeah, they're worried that somebody could essentially sabotage these cranes.
Right. And completely cripple U.S. ports.
Causing major disruption in our supply chain.
Exactly.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
I mean, what can we even do about it? Do we just rip out all the cranes and start over?
No, it's definitely not that simple. It's a very delicate balancing act.
Okay.
We have to weigh these economic benefits against the security risks
Mhm.
and find a way to mitigate the risks.
So things like really rigorous security protocols,
Yeah.
independent audits of the software and the hardware, maybe even looking at alternative suppliers.
Exactly. It's definitely a wake-up call.
Okay.
It urges us to really think strategically about our reliance on foreign technology,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to critical infrastructure.
All right, let's move on to a story about a sneaky tactic used by hackers called repo swatting.
Mm-hmm.
This one targets code repositories on platforms like GitHub and GitLab. These are essentially the places where developers go to collaborate and share code.
What's interesting about this attack is that it actually exploits a feature that was designed for good.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so how does it work?
Okay, so imagine an attacker wants to take down a specific code repository.
Mm.
So they create a private issue and upload a malicious file to that.
Wait, a private issue,
Yeah.
so no one else can see it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then they report their own malicious file as violating the platform's terms of service.
So they basically plant a digital bomb and then call the authorities to detonate it.
Pretty much. And
Golly.
because that file is hidden in a private issue,
Uh-huh.
it's actually pretty difficult for the platform to quickly verify that it's legitimate or not.
Okay.
And that leads to them taking down the entire repository as a precaution.
Oh, wow.
So it disrupts the work of legitimate developers.
So it's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned features can be weaponized, right?
Exactly.
So what can platforms like GitHub and GitLab do to combat this?
Well, it's really a constant game of cat and mouse.
Uh-huh.
They need to find ways to quickly verify these reported violations, especially those that involve hidden content.
Mm.
They also need to improve their communication with developers and provide clear guidelines on how to report suspicious activity.
So it highlights the challenge of content moderation, right?
Absolutely.
In the digital world.
It's this balancing act between fostering open collaboration
Yeah.
and protecting users from harm.
Okay, now speaking of protecting users from harm,
Yeah.
you would think a leading security company like Palo Alto Networks would have security locked down tight, right?
What? Think so?
Well, it turns out even the experts can make mistakes.
Yeah, and it's really a case that emphasizes the importance of making good design choices
Right.
and avoiding unnecessary complexity.
Okay, spill the beans. What happened?
So Palo Alto Networks recently had 2 zero-day vulnerabilities discovered in their firewalls.
Okay.
Firewalls are the gatekeepers of network security, and what's really concerning is that these vulnerabilities stemmed from some rather questionable design choices.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give us the juicy details.
All right. So, for starters, they implemented their firewall software using PHP. It's a
Okay,
language known for its versatility,
Yeah.
but not really for its strong security.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, their authentication system actually relied on a rather hacky PHP feature that the developers themselves had acknowledged in the source code comments as a bad idea.
Wait, they knew it was a bad idea.
You knew it was a bad idea, yeah.
But they did it anyway.
Yeah.
What were they thinking?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's a really valuable lesson for all of us, even for those of us who are not in the tech world, right?
Yeah.
Complexity can breed these vulnerabilities.
Right.
Sometimes the simplest solution is the most secure one.
Yeah, I think that's a good reminder for anyone who's designing anything, systems, processes.
Yeah.
Complexity makes it harder to spot those little cracks.
Exactly. It also reinforces this need for good coding practices,
Mhm.
thorough testing.
Right.
No system's perfect, but we can minimize that risk by being really mindful about how we design and build things.
Now let's talk about a situation where end of life doesn't just mean outdated, it means end of security. A security researcher recently discovered a critical vulnerability in 6 older D-Link VPN routers.
Oh, yeah.
And the problem is these routers are no longer supported. They will never get patched.
Yeah, it's really a stark reminder of the risks of using outdated hardware. It's
Right.
not just about performance anymore, it's about security.
Yeah.
This vulnerability allows anyone to gain complete control of those affected routers,
Wow.
giving them essentially the keys to the network.
So what's the takeaway for all of us? I mean, I'm sure I've got some old gadgets in a drawer somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure we all do.
Should we all be running out and replacing all our old tech?
Replacing end-of-life hardware is definitely good practice.
Okay.
But for a lot of people, especially those who are not very tech-savvy,
Right.
it's not always easy or affordable.
So what can people do to protect themselves?
Well, just being aware of the risks is a good first step.
Right.
So if you're using an older device, especially one that connects to the internet,
Yeah.
be extra cautious about what websites you visit, what information you're sharing.
So basically, treat those old devices like a rickety bridge. Cross with caution.
Exactly. And if at all possible, try to isolate them from your main network.
Okay.
So if you have an old router, for example, don't use it for your main home network,
Good advice.
just to minimize the risk.
It's all about minimizing the risk.
Exactly. And remember, even if you can't replace that hardware, you can still take steps to improve security by keeping your software updated, using strong passwords, being wary of any suspicious emails or links.
It seems like security is a never-ending game of whack-a-mole.
It can feel like that sometimes.
Plug in a hole, another one pops
Yeah,
up.
yeah. But the key is to stay informed,
Okay.
be proactive, and don't be afraid to ask for help.
Okay, let's move on to a blast from the past one that might make you feel a little nostalgic. Remember Windows Recall?
Oh yeah, Windows Recall.
It was this feature that let you scroll back in time on your computer, but it was pulled due to privacy concerns.
That was both fascinating
Right.
and kind of creepy at the same time.
Like having a digital time machine.
Totally.
But it also made you wonder what exactly was being recorded.
Yeah, who has access to this?
Exactly. Well, Microsoft is bringing it back,
They are.
but with a twist. They claim this new version will address those privacy concerns
Okay.
by giving users more control over what gets recorded
Okay.
and how the data is used.
So they're trying to walk this very fine line
Yeah.
between convenience and privacy.
A tough one to balance.
It is. And what's really interesting is they're also introducing this new AI-powered feature called Click to Do
What?
that analyzes the content of snapshots.
So I can take a snapshot of my screen
Yeah.
and the AI can understand what's in it.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine you're scrolling through a web page and you see a phone number that you want to save.
Okay?
You can just take a snapshot, select the phone number in that image,
Wow.
and then choose to, I don't know, copy it, search for it online, even send it in an email.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
But it also makes you wonder, how much AI integration is too much?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And it's something we're all going to have to grapple with
Right.
as AI becomes more integrated into our everyday lives.
Exactly. Speaking of AI integration, this next story is kind of an eye-opener. It turns out Microsoft has been quietly enabling a feature called Connected Experiences that uses the content of Office documents. Word docs, spreadsheets for training AI models.
It's a move that definitely raises concerns about transparency and user control over their data. So this feature is reportedly enabled by default. And while Microsoft claims that most of these connected experiences don't retain user content, there are actually some exceptions where they do keep it. Okay.
And they keep it for as long as the user account exists.
So even if they're not keeping everything, they're still collecting and analyzing our data without really being upfront about it.
Yeah, it's really that lack of transparency.
Yeah.
Users should be informed about how their data is being used and given a clear choice to opt out if they're not comfortable with it.
So what can people do if they're concerned about this? Is there a way to disable it?
Absolutely. You can disable connected experiences in the privacy settings of your Office applications.
Okay.
It is kind of buried in the menus, but it's there.
Right.
We'll make sure to include instructions in the show notes for those who want to find it.
That's great. It's a good reminder that we do have some control over our data,
We do.
even if it takes a little digging.
It does.
Okay.
Staying informed and proactive is key.
Okay.
The more we understand about how our data is being used,
The better equipped we are to make good decisions about our privacy. Speaking of data, there's another interesting story making the rounds.
lay it on us.
Seems there's been a big uptick in ransomware attacks targeting cloud services.
Ransomware in the cloud. I thought the cloud was supposed to be more secure.
Well, that's the perception,
Then,
but the reality is that the cloud is just as vulnerable
Yeah.
as any other system if it's not properly secured. And what we're seeing is attackers are getting more and more sophisticated.
So how are they doing it? Are they exploiting vulnerabilities in the cloud providers themselves?
It's a combination of factors. Sometimes, yeah, it is exploiting vulnerabilities in the cloud provider infrastructure itself,
Okay.
but more often than not, it's human error.
Ah,
So things like phishing attacks,
Right.
weak passwords,
right.
misconfigured security settings, all the usual suspects.
So it's not just about the technology, it's about the people using it.
Exactly. And what's particularly troubling about these cloud-based ransomware attacks is that they often target critical data backups,
Oh, wow.
making it much harder for victims to recover their data
Oh, right.
without paying the ransom.
That's a nightmare scenario for any business or organization.
It is.
So what can they do to protect themselves?
Well, for starters, they really need to prioritize security from the ground up. That means implementing strong passwords,
Yeah.
multi-factor authentication,
Okay.
and doing those regular security audits.
So the same best practices we've been talking about all along,
Totally.
just applied to the cloud.
Absolutely. It's also crucial to have this robust backup and recovery plan.
Okay.
That means backing up to multiple locations,
Right.
both on-site and off-site,
Okay.
and testing those procedures often.
Makes sense. Like having an escape route if your data center goes up in flames.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about having that layered approach to security.
Okay. Before we move on, I want to address a question that I know is on a lot of people's minds right now, AI. Seems like it's everywhere these days.
It is.
Chatbots to self-driving cars. And while it has the potential to revolutionize many aspects of our lives, it also raises a host of new security challenges.
Yeah, AI is kind of a double-edged sword, right?
It is.
On one hand, it can be used to actually enhance our security
Yeah.
by detecting and responding to threats much faster than humans.
So AI could actually be our ally in this fight.
Absolutely. But on the other hand,
Mm-hmm.
AI itself can be vulnerable to attacks. Attackers could manipulate AI algorithms, introduce bias, even hijack AI systems for their own purposes.
So AI can be both the hero and the villain.
Exactly. And as AI becomes more sophisticated and more pervasive,
Right.
the stakes are only going to get higher.
So what can we do to prepare for this new AI-driven threat landscape?
Well, for starters, we need to actually educate ourselves
Okay.
about the potential risks and how to actually mitigate those. That means understanding how AI algorithms work, what their limitations are, how they can be manipulated.
So lifting the hood
Yeah.
and taking a look under the surface.
Yeah, we can't just blindly trust that AI is always going to be used for good.
Exactly. And we need to demand more transparency and accountability from the companies that are developing this technology.
Absolutely.
We need to know how our data is being used to train these systems, what safeguards are in place, and what recourse we have if something goes wrong.
Yeah, it's about wielding this powerful technology accountable.
Right.
We can't assume that they're always going to have our best interests at heart.
Exactly. And as individuals, we need to be more vigilant about protecting our personal data and being very wary of these AI-powered scams.
Yeah, we have to be aware of those phishing attacks.
Oh, absolutely. It's a whole new world of digital dangers. We need to be prepared. Now let's talk about deepfakes.
Oh yeah, deepfakes.
They're a perfect example of how AI can be used for malicious purposes. They're essentially videos or audio recordings that have been manipulated to make it look like someone is doing or saying something they never actually did.
And they're incredibly realistic these days.
They are. I've seen some of these deepfakes online, and it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's fake.
That's the real danger, right? Deepfakes can be used to spread misinformation, damage reputations, incite violence.
So it's not just about harmless fun anymore. Deepfakes have become a real threat.
Absolutely. And what's concerning is that the technology is becoming much more accessible and much easier to use.
Right, so it's not just nation-state actors or sophisticated hackers.
Exactly.
So anyone with a computer and an internet connection can create one of these.
Pretty much. And as the technology keeps getting better,
Yeah.
it's only going to become more difficult to detect them.
So what can we do to combat this threat? Is there any way to tell if a video or an audio recording is real or fake?
Well, there are some technical clues. Okay.
The experts can look for?
Uh-huh.
But even those are getting less reliable as the technology improves. So ultimately, it comes down to being more critical of the media that we consume.
So don't believe everything you see and hear online.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If something seems too good to be true or too outrageous,
Right.
probably is.
Yeah.
And if you're unsure, do your research. Check multiple sources. Look for that corroborating evidence.
Yeah.
Be wary of anything that's trying to evoke strong emotions or push a particular agenda.
So media literacy in the age of AI.
Absolutely.
We need to be savvy consumers of information
Yes.
and not just blindly believe everything we see and hear.
Exactly. And we also need to demand more accountability from social media platforms
Right.
and online platforms that host these deepfakes.
Okay.
They have a responsibility to flag
Yeah.
or even remove this content
Right.
that's demonstrably fake.
So it's a shared responsibility. Individuals need to be more discerning,
Yes.
and platforms need to do more to prevent the spread of this stuff.
Okay, now let's talk about a vulnerability that hit a little closer to home, a security flaw discovered in a popular password manager.
Ooh.
You know, those apps that help you generate and store all those passwords?
Yeah, password managers are supposed to be the guardians of our digital identity.
Exactly.
So when one of those gets compromised, it's a big deal.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
I rely on a password manager for everything. So what happened?
So this particular vulnerability allowed attackers to potentially steal the encrypted password vaults
Oh,
that were stored on users' devices.
Wait, so all those passwords that I thought were safely locked away could have been stolen?
That was the risk, yeah. Luckily, the company that developed this password manager actually discovered the vulnerability and patched it very quickly.
Okay, that's it.
But it is a reminder that even those tools that we rely on to protect our data can still have vulnerabilities.
So what's the lesson here? Should we all be ditching password managers and going back to writing our passwords on sticky notes?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, good.
Password managers are still a very essential tool.
Okay.
The problem isn't with password managers themselves,
Yeah.
it's with the implementation.
So it's about choosing a reputable password manager that has a strong track record
Exactly.
and takes this vulnerability disclosure stuff seriously.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So look for ones that use strong encryption,
Huh.
have a transparent security policy,
Right.
and that regularly update their software.
Good advice. It's all about doing your research and picking a provider you can trust.
Exactly. And remember, no system is perfect. Even with the best security measures,
Right.
there's always that risk of vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
So it's really important to have multiple layers of security, like multi-factor authentication, strong passwords,
Right.
and just being aware of those potential risks
Yeah.
so you can take steps to mitigate them.
Solid advice. Okay. Let's talk about the metaverse.
The metaverse.
So the metaverse is essentially a collective term for immersive digital worlds that are accessed through VR headsets.
Yeah, it's kind of like stepping into a video game,
Yeah.
but with real-world consequences.
Okay, so that's starting to make more sense.
Yeah.
But what are the security challenges? I mean, it's all virtual, right? So what is there to steal?
Well, in the metaverse, your digital identity is the most valuable asset.
Okay.
Just like in the real world, there are people who want to steal your identity, your virtual possessions, your data.
So it's like the Wild West,
It's kind of like the Wild West of the internet.
where anything goes.
Yeah. The rules are still being written. That's why it's so important to be really aware of the potential risks
Okay.
and take steps to protect yourself.
So what can we do to stay safe in the metaverse? Are there any best practices we can follow?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, be careful about what information you share.
Right?
Don't give out your real name, your address, any other sensitive information.
Yeah.
And just be wary of scams and phishing attempts.
To use caution,
Yeah.
common sense.
Yeah, it's the same as anywhere online, really.
Exactly.
It's also important to choose strong passwords for
Right.
your metaverse accounts and enable two-factor authentication if it's offered.
Good tips. Anything else?
Well, it's also important to just be aware of your surroundings and to report any suspicious activity to the platform provider.
Yeah.
And if you are using a VR or AR headset, make sure it's from a reputable manufacturer
Right.
and that you keep your software updated.
So it's about being proactive
Yeah,
and taking responsibility for our security, just like we do in the real world.
exactly. The metaverse has a lot of potential to be this amazing transformative technology,
Yeah, it does.
but it's important to approach it with a little bit of caution and awareness.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to talk about something we've mentioned several times today, the importance of staying informed.
Absolutely, especially in this rapidly evolving world.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power. The more we understand about the threats we face, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves.
So how can people stay informed?
Mm-hmm.
There's so much information out there. It
Yeah.
can be overwhelming.
It can be. It's really about finding those reliable sources of information and just making sure you're up to date on all the latest trends and
The
threats.
things like following reputable security blogs, maybe subscribing to a few newsletters, attending a webinar here or there, anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And just don't be afraid to ask questions. If you're unsure about something, reach out to an expert. There's tons of resources online and in
It's
libraries.
about being curious and proactive.
Exactly. And remember, cybersecurity isn't just about technology.
Yeah,
It's really about people.
it is.
It's about making smart choices, being aware of the risks,
Right.
and taking those steps to protect yourself and your data.
Makes sense.
It really is amazing how fast things change in the tech world. Feels like just yesterday we were marveling at smartphones.
I know, right?
And now we're talking about metaverse and AI as if it's an everyday thing.
It's true. It's like living in a science fiction novel. And speaking of things changing quickly, let's talk about a rather alarming trend. We're seeing a growing number of systems that are still vulnerable to attacks using known vulnerabilities.
Yeah, this is a huge problem.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity research actually shows that there are hundreds of thousands of systems out there online right now
Wow.
that are still susceptible to exploits that were publicized last year.
Really?
You would think with all the advancements in security, we would be better at patching these holes.
So why are so many systems still vulnerable? Is it just that organizations aren't taking security seriously?
It's partly that some organizations just don't prioritize it
Yeah.
until it's too late.
Right.
They see it as an expense rather than an investment.
So it's about shifting the mindset. Security is core to operations,
Exactly.
not just an afterthought.
Exactly. But it's also a matter of complexity. A lot of these systems are so complex and interconnected,
Right.
it's really hard to keep track of all the vulnerabilities, let alone patch them quickly.
It's like trying to plug holes in a leaky boat while you're still at sea.
That's a great analogy. And unfortunately, there's no easy solution. It's a very complex problem
Yeah.
that requires a layered approach to fix it.
So what can organizations do to improve their security? I mean, where do they even start?
Well, for starters, they need to really establish a solid security culture. That
Yeah.
means making security everyone's responsibility, not just the IT department.
Right.
It also means providing employees with the training and resources they need to identify and report potential threats.
So empowering employees to be the first line of defense.
Precisely. And organizations also need to invest in solid security technologies, things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, endpoint protection software.
So building up those defenses.
Right. But technology alone isn't enough. They also need to develop and implement those strong security policies and procedures.
Okay.
So things like password management policies, data encryption policies, incident response plans.
So having those blueprints for how to handle different security scenarios.
Exactly. And testing them regularly, right? Make sure they're effective.
Right. Being prepared for the inevitable. Because we all know no system's perfect. Breaches happen.
Absolutely. The goal isn't to prevent all breaches. That's impossible. The goal is to actually minimize that risk and impact when they do happen.
So it's about damage control and recovery.
Right.
Being able to bounce back quickly.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point, backups.
Oh, yes. Backups. The often overlooked but absolutely essential part of security.
Exactly. Data is the lifeblood of many organizations these days.
It is.
And if you lose your data, you can lose your business. So it's really critical to have that robust backup and recovery plan in place.
So what does a good backup plan look like?
Well, first and foremost, you need to back up your data often. And I don't just mean once a week, once a month.
Right.
Ideally, continuous backups, or at least daily, depending on the nature of your business.
So making sure you have a very recent copy of your data in case the worst happens.
Right. And store those backups in a secure location offsite.
Okay.
You don't want them on the same server as
Yeah.
your primary data, because if that server or location is compromised, your backups are gone too.
So it's all about that redundancy, that
Yeah.
safety net.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to test those backups regularly.
Okay.
Make sure that you can actually restore your data if you need to.
Makes sense. You know, it's like having a fire extinguisher but not knowing how to use it.
That's a great analogy. Backups are pretty useless if you can't restore from them.
So backups are just a critical part of any organization's security strategy.
Absolutely. They're like an insurance policy for your data. You hope you never have to use it, but if you do, you'll be glad you have it.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and get a little more technical. Remember our discussion about capturing command and control traffic from malware? We got some great feedback from our listeners
Yeah.
about a technique called hairpin net.
Yes, hairpin net. It's a technique that allows you to redirect traffic that's destined for a specific external IP address
Aye.
back to a local server. It's
Oh.
often used in home networks, but it can also be used for security.
So imagine you have a device on your network that's infected with malware,
Mm.
and that malware is trying to communicate with its command and control server, which is out on the internet somewhere.
Right. And usually that traffic would just flow out of your network to that server.
Yeah.
But with Hairpin Net, you can basically trick the malware into talking to a server that you control that's on your own network.
So instead of sending its secrets out to the bad guys,
Right.
it's sending them to a honeypot
Exactly.
where you can analyze them.
Exactly. It's a very clever way to monitor that traffic without actually tipping off the malware that it's being watched.
That's awesome. So it's like setting a trap and then having a front row seat to watch the bad guys walk right into it.
That's a great way to put it, and it's relatively easy to set up
Okay.
if you're familiar with networking.
So this is something security professionals, but also just technically inclined individuals could use.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great.
And speaking of tools and techniques, another listener actually wrote in with a clarification about Cloudflare Tunnel.
Cloudflare Tunnel. That's a service that lets you create secure tunnels back to your home network, right?
Yes, that's right. It's a very popular tool, especially for developers and people who like to tinker, who want to access their home network from anywhere. But it's important to know that Cloudflare Tunnel doesn't offer true end-to-end encryption.
Okay. So what does that mean?
Well, it means that while the traffic between your device and Cloudflare's network is encrypted, Cloudflare can still decrypt and inspect the traffic on their end.
So it's kind of like sending a sealed letter through a courier. The letter might be sealed, but the courier can still open it and read it.
That's a great analogy. So if you are really looking for that complete privacy and end-to-end encryption, Cloudflare Tunnel might not be the right choice.
So what are some alternatives? Are there VPNs that provide that true end-to-end encryption?
Absolutely. A popular option is Tailscale.
Okay.
It's a peer-to-peer VPN that uses WireGuard, a modern and secure VPN protocol, to create these encrypted tunnels. And because it's peer-to-peer, there's no central server
Right.
that can decrypt and inspect your traffic.
So it's like having a direct, secure line between those devices.
Exactly.
Okay, that's good to know.
And speaking of WireGuard, another listener actually shared a tip about its performance on iOS devices.
Oh, tell us more.
So it seems that WireGuard handles iOS sleep cycles way better than other VPN protocols. So with other VPNs, when your iOS device goes to sleep, the VPN connection can sometimes drop, causing apps to lose access to data when the device wakes up.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that frustration before.
Yeah, but WireGuard's lightweight design and its very fast connection renegotiation make it much more reliable.
Okay.
So if you're an iOS user and you use a VPN, WireGuard is definitely worth checking out.
That's a great tip.
Yeah.
It's amazing how knowledgeable our listeners are. It really does add a whole new layer to these discussions.
It's like having a global brainstorming session.
All right. Before we move on, I wanted to share a fun little anecdote that a listener sent in.
Oh, I love anecdotes.
This one involves a pretty unusual but really clever use of a device called the input stick. Have you ever heard of it?
The input stick, yeah. It's that little device that acts like a Bluetooth keyboard but connects through a USB dongle, right?
Exactly. And this listener uses it to enter those long, case-sensitive command strings when they're doing hardware repairs.
That's brilliant. I can see how that would be super useful, especially when you're dealing with those tiny on-screen keyboards.
Right. So simple, but it makes a complex task so much easier.
Exactly.
And it shows the ingenuity of our listeners. They're always finding creative solutions.
I agree. It's really inspiring to see how people are using technology in these unexpected ways.
All right, one last piece of feedback from a listener. This one is a tale of cautionary configuration. A listener wrote in about their Nokia router that they got from their ISP.
Ooh, those ISP-provided routers.
I know, right?
Right.
So this one was set to light filtering mode by default, which makes sense.
Right.
But get this, it wasn't performing NAT network address translation for the Ethernet connections.
Wait, no NAT for Ethernet. That's a major security flaw.
Right. So any device connected to that router's Ethernet port
Yeah.
was directly exposed to the internet.
It's like leaving your front door wide open.
Exactly.
The listener was thinking maybe the router was designed with the assumption that people would mainly connect through Wi-Fi,
Huh?
which did have NAT, but still a concerning thing to overlook.
It really highlights the importance of understanding your router's settings and not just blindly trusting the default configuration.
Absolutely. Routers are kind of the gatekeepers of our home networks. We have to make sure they're configured securely.
Now, after hearing all these stories about vulnerabilities and configuration mishaps,
Yeah.
it's easy to get a little overwhelmed, even paranoid about the state of cybersecurity.
It is understandable to feel that way.
Yeah.
Those threats are real.
They are.
They're constantly evolving. But it's important to remember that we're not powerless.
So what can we do to feel more empowered?
Well, we can focus on what we can control. Strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, keep your software updated,
Yeah.
be wary of those suspicious emails and links.
So the basics still matter.
Absolutely. That's really the foundation of good security hygiene. And we can also educate ourselves about the threats, the vulnerabilities. The more we know, the better equipped we are.
So knowledge is power.
Right.
Staying informed and being proactive.
Exactly. And we can demand more from the companies that create this technology.
Right.
Hold them accountable for building secure products, being transparent about their data collection practices, and responding to vulnerabilities quickly and responsibly.
So using our voices as consumers to push for better security and privacy.
Exactly. We have a right to expect that the technology we use is secure and that our data is protected.
I love that. It's about reclaiming our power in the digital world.
Absolutely.
Now, before we move on, I want to bring up a question that came up during our discussion about those Microsoft Connected experiences.
Oh, yeah.
The question of where do we draw the line between convenience and privacy in the age of AI?
Right.
It's becoming more and more relevant as AI gets integrated into everything.
It's definitely a delicate balance. There's no easy answer.
Right.
It's really a personal decision that each individual has to make.
So it's about weighing the benefits and the risks, deciding what level of convenience we're okay with in exchange for our data.
Exactly. And we have to remember we have a choice. We can choose to use products that do prioritize privacy, or we can choose to opt out of that data collection whenever possible.
So we're not just passive recipients of technology. We do have agency.
Yeah.
We can make choices that align with our values.
Absolutely. The more we exercise that agency, the more we demand better from those companies,
Right.
the more likely we are to shape that future where technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
I love that vision. Okay, let's move on and talk about a topic that has been in the news a lot. The rise of cyber warfare.
Cyber warfare.
So cyber warfare is essentially the use of digital attacks to disrupt or disable an adversary's computer systems.
Yeah.
It's a growing threat
Yeah,
that has the potential to cause serious damage, both physical and digital.
absolutely.
I've been hearing a lot about cyber attacks targeting things like power grids, hospitals, even election systems.
Yeah, those are all valid concerns. Cyber attacks can definitely be used to disrupt essential services, steal sensitive information, even cause physical damage.
So it's not just about stealing data anymore, it's about causing harm in the real world.
Exactly. And the stakes are only getting higher as more and more of our critical infrastructure is connected to the internet.
So it's a matter of national security.
Absolutely. Cyber warfare is a significant threat,
Yeah.
and governments around the world are taking steps to bolster their cyber defenses.
So what can we do as individuals to protect ourselves from something like cyber warfare? It feels kind of beyond our control.
Well, it's true. Those nation-state actors, they have a lot of resources, they have sophisticated capabilities,
Yeah.
but there are still things we can do as individuals to make ourselves less vulnerable.
Okay. Like what?
Well, for starters, we can practice good cyber hygiene. Use strong passwords, enable multi-factor authentication, keep our software updated, and just be wary of those phishing attempts.
So the same basic advice we give for everyday threats.
Exactly. Those basic principles apply regardless of the attacker.
Right.
We can stay informed about the latest threats, vulnerabilities. The more we know, the better equipped we are.
So knowledge is our best weapon.
It's a powerful one. And we can also support organizations that are working to actually improve cybersecurity
Okay.
and hold governments accountable for their actions in cyberspace.
So using our voices and advocating for strong cyber defenses.
Right. We can't just sit back and wait for governments to solve this. We all have a role to play.
I love that message. Okay, let's move on to another topic that's been generating controversy lately. The use of facial recognition technology.
Facial recognition.
So it's a powerful technology with the potential for good,
Yeah.
catching criminals or finding missing people.
Yeah.
But it also has those concerns about privacy.
Right.
I've seen facial recognition used for unlocking phones, tagging friends in photos,
Huh?
but I've also heard about it being used for surveillance.
Yeah. And that's where the controversy is. Governments and law enforcement are increasingly using facial recognition for surveillance, often without clear guidelines or any oversight.
So it's a matter of transparency and accountability.
Exactly. We need to have an open conversation as a society about how this technology is being used, what the risks are, and what safeguards we have.
So it's not just about the tech itself, it's about the ethical implications.
Right.
How it's used.
We need to make sure that the use of facial recognition is proportionate, necessary, and justified.
Striking that balance between security and privacy.
Exactly. It's a complex issue, but one that we can't just ignore.
Okay, before we move on, I wanted to share a story that a listener sent in about how they were targeted by a pretty sophisticated phishing attack.
Oh, phishing. It seems like no matter how much we educate people about it, people still fall victim.
They're always evolving. It's hard to stay ahead. So tell me about this listener's experience. What happened?
So this listener got an email that looked like it was from their bank. It was really official looking with the bank logo, the branding, said there was a problem with their account and they needed to click a link to verify some info.
So the classic, create a sense of urgency and trick people into clicking a link.
Exactly. But this listener, they were suspicious.
Okay.
They hovered over the link, didn't click it, and they noticed something was off. The link didn't go to the bank website. It went to a totally different website that was designed to look like the bank's.
So a fake website designed to steal their login credentials.
Exactly. It was very well crafted. But this listener was paying attention, caught it just in time.
That's a great example of how vigilance can save you.
It is.
Paying attention to details.
It highlights why you have to be skeptical of unsolicited emails, especially those asking you to click links or provide personal information.
Right. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly. And if you're ever unsure, contact the organization directly, use a phone number, an email address, is legit to verify it.
Solid advice. Always better to err on the side of caution.
Agreed. Now, let's talk about a topic that's been getting a lot of attention lately. Artificial intelligence in warfare.
AI in warfare. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It may sound futuristic, but it's becoming more and more real. AI is being used to develop these autonomous weapon systems, to analyze intelligence data, and even make decisions about targeting and engagement.
So machines making life or death decisions.
Yes, and it raises so many ethical and legal questions.
Like who's accountable if an AI-powered weapon makes a mistake?
That's one of the big questions. There are so many others. For example, how do we make sure that AI is used in a way that's consistent with international law? How do we prevent it from escalating conflict?
Yeah.
How do we ensure humans are still in control of the use of force?
Those are some really big questions. And it sounds like we don't have all the answers yet.
Not yet. It's a rapidly evolving field. The implications are still being debated, but it's a conversation we need to have.
Right. The stakes are too high to ignore.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about something closer to home. The security of smart homes.
Smart homes.
They're becoming more and more popular
Yeah.
as more devices get connected to the internet. Thermostats, cameras, refrigerators. I even heard of smart coffee makers now.
There's a smart version of everything these days.
But all this connectivity also creates new security risks.
Of course.
I love being able to control my lights and thermostat from my phone,
Yeah.
but I've also heard those stories about hackers taking over devices and using them for, bad things.
Yeah, and those stories are true. Smart home devices are vulnerable, just like anything else that's connected.
Okay.
And if your smart home is compromised, hackers can access your personal information,
Right.
spy on you, even control your physical systems.
That is kind of scary. So what can we do to protect our smart homes?
Well, we can choose devices from those manufacturers that have a strong track record for security.
So doing your research before you buy.
Exactly. Change those default passwords, enable two-factor authentication if it's an option.
So the same basic stuff we do for computers and phones.
Pretty much. And be mindful of the data that those devices collect.
What do you mean?
A lot of smart home devices are collecting a lot of data about your habits and your preferences. When you're home,
Yeah.
what temperature you like your house, what you're watching on TV.
That's a lot of information.
It is. It's important to know what data they're collecting and how it's used.
So reading those privacy policies.
Yes, it's important. And if you're not comfortable with a particular device's data practices, just don't use it.
So we do have choices.
Yeah.
We have control.
Absolutely. And we can also take steps to secure our home networks, strong Wi-Fi passwords, enabling that firewall.
So those basic network security things still matter.
More important now than ever in the age of smart homes.
Good to know. All right, before we wrap things up, I want to touch on a question that's been on my mind lately. the future of cybersecurity.
The big question. What does the future hold? It's impossible to know for sure,
Right.
but we can make some educated guesses based on what we're seeing now.
So what do you see on the horizon? What are some of the key trends shaping the future of cybersecurity?
Well, first, I think we're going to see this rise in the sophistication and frequency of attacks.
So the bad guys are going to keep getting better.
Unfortunately, yes. They're always finding new ways to exploit those vulnerabilities and get around security measures. And they're using things like artificial intelligence and automation to make their attacks even more effective.
So we're going to have to up our game as well.
Absolutely. We need better security technologies, more sophisticated strategies, and we have to be more proactive,
Okay.
anticipating those threats and taking steps to mitigate them before they cause harm.
So one step ahead.
Exactly. And it's about collaboration. We need to work together across industries and across borders to share info, share best practices, and resources.
So a united front against cybercrime.
Exactly. And I think we're also going to see more emphasis on the human element of cybersecurity.
What do you mean by that?
For too long, cybersecurity has been seen as this purely technical problem.
Right.
But humans are often the weakest link. So we need to educate people, empower them to be more security conscious, make good choices, and report those suspicious activities.
Creating a culture of cybersecurity.
Exactly. And a greater focus on the ethical implications.
What do you mean?
Technology is getting more powerful.
It is.
We need to make sure it's used for good, not harm. We need to discuss the ethical principles that guide how we develop and use this technology.
So using it to protect people, not to exploit them.
Precisely.
I love that.
Hmm.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this part of our deep dive. We covered a lot, from those technical exploits to the bigger issues of cyber warfare and AI. We explored the future and the importance of staying ahead.
It's been great.
Yeah?
I hope our listeners learned something.
Me too. And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
We appreciate your curiosity, your engagement, your questions. We'll be back soon with more insights and analysis, so stay tuned. One of the things I find so interesting about cybersecurity is it's not just about the technology.
Yeah,
It's about people.
absolutely. Understanding how people think, how they can be manipulated.
Cybersecurity, it's a psychological game as much as a technical one.
Right.
And that's what makes it so challenging,
Yeah.
but also so fascinating.
It's a constant game of cat and mouse,
Yes.
with the attackers always trying to stay ahead.
Speaking of attackers, one of our listeners wrote in with a really interesting question.
Oh.
They want to know, how can you tell the difference between intentional backdoors
Okay.
and unintentional security flaws?
The question of intent.
Right.
It's a tricky one. How can we tell if a vulnerability was put there on purpose or if it was just an oversight?
Well, sometimes it's obvious.
Okay.
Like if you find a hard-coded backdoor account
Uh,
with a password like a password 123,
yeah.
that's a pretty clear sign that someone wanted to create a way to bypass security.
So it's like finding a secret passage in the castle wall.
Exactly.
thing.
Not an accident.
But a lot of times, it's not that clear cut. You might find a vulnerability, but it's hard to say if it was intentional or not. Maybe a coding error or maybe sabotage.
So how do we figure out what was going on in the developer's head? Any clues to look for?
There are some things to consider. One is the complexity of that vulnerability.
Yeah.
If it's a really sophisticated one that requires deep knowledge of the system to exploit,
Mm-hmm.
that might point to it being intentional.
Like finding a trap door, cleverly disguised.
Right.
Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide it.
Exactly. But if it's something simple, like a buffer overflow,
Yeah.
that could be exploited easily.
Right.
That might point to it being accidental.
So it's about the skill and effort it takes to exploit it.
Right. Also, look at the company's track record.
Yeah.
History of security problems. Based in a country with a history of cyber espionage. Red flags.
So context matters.
Exactly. And sometimes we just don't know for sure.
Yeah.
Not enough evidence. It's a bit of a mystery.
A cyber whodunit.
Yeah, sometimes. But even if we don't know for sure, it's still important to analyze those vulnerabilities.
Right.
Understand how they can be exploited and try to minimize the risks.
It's about protecting ourselves, no matter the motive.
Right. Speaking of protection, we got a really nice story from one of our listeners.
Oh, I love these listener stories.
This one wrote to tell us that our podcast actually inspired them to get into cybersecurity.
No way.
Yeah, they were self-taught and they said they used our show to learn.
That's amazing.
It makes it all worthwhile, you know.
It does.
to know we're making a difference.
It shows that a little spark can really ignite a passion.
It can.
And speaking of sparks, let's talk AI and surveillance.
Ah, yes. AI is changing how surveillance works, making it more powerful, more widespread.
I've seen those reports about cities using AI cameras, tracking people, looking for suspicious behavior. It's a little creepy.
It is, and it raises big questions about privacy.
Yeah.
With AI, you can analyze so much data, videos, social media, even financial transactions, to find patterns and try to predict behavior.
So Big Brother, but on a whole new level.
Yeah, in a way. And this technology is only going to get more sophisticated.
It seems like it's moving so fast.
It is. We're already seeing AI that can recognize faces, emotions, even intentions.
Wow.
So where's the line?
Right.
How do we balance security and the right to privacy?
That's the big question.
It is. There's no easy answer. Ethical, legal, societal implications. This is a conversation we need to have as a society.
To make sure that technology is used ethically.
Exactly. Speaking of responsibility, we have to talk about the responsibility companies have to protect our data.
Right. We've seen so many data breaches.
We have.
Clearly, a lot of companies aren't doing enough.
It seems like every week there's a new story
Uh-oh.
about a company losing millions of records.
Makes you want to just go off the grid.
I get it, but it's almost impossible these days.
It is.
We shop online, we use social media, we bank online. It all generates data that companies collect.
So we're trading our data for convenience.
In a lot of ways, yes. But that doesn't mean we have to give it up without any guarantees.
Right.
We should expect them to keep it safe.
So how do we hold them accountable?
Well, we can choose companies with a good track record.
Okay.
Vote with our wallets. Support organizations fighting for stronger data protection laws.
So speaking up, making our voices heard.
Exactly. And taking steps to protect ourselves. Strong passwords, multi-factor, be careful what we share.
So we have some control, we're not powerless.
Right. Being proactive, not reactive. We have a role to play in shaping a digital world that's safe and respects our privacy.
Well said. Okay, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into cybersecurity.
It has been quite a journey.
It has. We covered a lot.
We didn't.
From the technical details to the ethical implications of all this technology.
It's been fascinating.
It has. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us.
Yes, thank you all.
We appreciate your curiosity, your questions, your engagement.
Until next time, stay safe online, everyone.